Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is State Plans for 100% Clean Electricity, Updates from California and Rhode Island. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of our 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, and we have some excellent speakers with us on the line from California and Rhode Island. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen here. You can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. We encourage you to do this throughout the webinar. We'll be saving some time following our presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So do type those in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of all of the webinar slides, probably this afternoon, tomorrow at the latest. And we'll also be posting those on CISA's website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is the organization hosting this webinar today, and he will be getting us started.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. I want to tell you a few things about Clean Energy States Alliance, or CISA as we call it, and also about the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative before we start the presentations. Clean Energy Collaborative, the Clean Energy States Alliance, is a national membership organization composed of public agencies across the country. Most of our members are state agencies. You can see them up on the screen here. We do a lot of information sharing among them. We do group projects, and as a collective, we try to advance clean energy, especially in the electricity sector. If we could go to the next slide. And one of our projects is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, which is working to help states and other entities that have 100% clean energy goals. We help them by providing knowledge sharing activities and analysis so that they can address program challenges and opportunities. We also work with states that don't yet have 100% clean energy goals, but are considering adopting such goals. And this collaborative is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're very pleased to note that we are now doing this in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance, and our two organizations are going to work to make sure our activities complement each other and help states as much as possible move towards 100% clean energy. You can go to our website for the collaborative, where you'll see things like a table with information about all the states that have 100% clean energy. We have a range of publications. You can see archived webinars. You can also sign up to get on the mailing list, where we do monthly a newsletter about what's going on across the country related to 100% clean energy at the state level. If we could go to the next slide. So one of the things that's been happening lately, which is very encouraging and exciting, is that states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals for their electricity sector are now working hard to put together plans and processes for how they're going to achieve those goals. And two of the states that recently came out with important and very interesting reports marking how they're going to move forward towards 100% clean energy are California and Rhode Island. And we have with us two individuals today who will tell us about what their states are planning and how they went about putting together their latest planning documents. I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers now, and we'll introduce the second one before he speaks. So I'm going to introduce Liz Gill now because she's going to be speaking about California, and she's an electric generation system specialist in the Planning and Modeling Unit at the California Energy Commission. She served as the technical lead on the 2021 SB 100 Joint Agency Report that we'll be hearing about, and that provided an initial assessment of California's 100% clean electricity policy. Prior to being at the Energy Commission, she was the Grid Policy Director at the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of California at Davis. Well, Liz, you're on to tell us about the California plan.
All right. Thank you, Warren, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Liz Gill, and I'm an electric generation system specialist at the California Energy Commission in the Planning and Modeling Unit, and was the technical lead for the 2021 SB 100 Joint Agency Report. So today I'm going to discuss the context, scope, and some of the key findings of this first report evaluating the pathway to 100% clean electricity in California. The final report came out about 3 weeks ago. It's about 180 pages or so. We also published a 12-page high-level summary document. So if you're really interested in getting into the weeds, I highly recommend downloading the report from the Energy Commission's website at energy.ca.gov/SB100, since we will be keeping things at a pretty high level today. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge the many contributors to this report. It was a joint agency effort, and a lot of collaboration went in to get to where we are. So we had numerous staff from the Energy Commission who took the lead on the report, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Resources Board. I'd probably take up the bulk of my time if I actually named everyone individually, but the principals that provided guidance and insight were Chair Hochschild from the Energy Commission, former Commissioner Randolph from the PUC, who is now the chair of the Air Resources Board, former Chair Nichols from the Air Resources Board, and Commissioner McAllister from the Energy Commission. And so with that, let's get into the report. I can advance my slides. There we go. All right, so first, Senate Bill 100, or SB 100, was signed into law in September of 2018, and it primarily does three things. First, it establishes the policy that eligible renewable and zero carbon resources will supply 100% of all retail sales and electricity procured to serve state loads by 2045. Second, it expands the RPS from 50% to 60% by 2030. So sometimes when folks refer to SB 100, this is what they're referring to, but today we're really just focused in on that 2045 policy. And then finally, it requires the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Resources Board to use existing programs to achieve the 2045 policy, and to also issue a joint agency report to the legislature every 4 years, which is what we'll be focused on today. So SB 100 is central to achieving the state's goal of economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2045, as electrification is likely to be a central strategy to making economy-wide greenhouse gas reductions. So increasingly, clean electricity will be needed to power transportation, building, and industrial operations in order to decarbonize those sectors. And on this chart, we can see the makeup of California's 2018 greenhouse gas emissions. And we see that along with electricity generation and imports, these sectors account for 92% of the state's total carbon emissions. So between electrification and clean electricity, we have the potential to really dig deep into these economy-wide reductions. In addition to serving as a key pillar in the state's efforts to mitigate climate change, SB 100 is expected to benefit residents across the state in several ways. First, through improving public health, primarily through a reduction in criteria air pollution, as over time, clean energy resources replace fossil fuels in generating electricity. Second, through advancing energy equity by moving towards the 100% target in ways to help ensure equitable outcomes. So this could be such as alleviating the public health burden in disadvantaged communities where a disproportionate number of the state's fossil gas power plants are located. And then it can also support a clean energy economy. So by restoring thousands of clean energy jobs lost during the pandemic and creating many more high quality jobs and career pathways. And as we get into the results, I'll talk about the magnitude of the resources that we're projecting that we'll need in order to achieve SB 100 while electrifying large portions of the economy. And while it will be a challenge to meet this goal, it also represents a huge economic and workforce opportunity. All right, so now getting into the report itself. So as mentioned, this report is the first step to evaluate the challenges and opportunities in achieving the 100% clean electricity goal by 2045. So this report includes an initial assessment of the additional energy resources and the resource build rate needed to achieve this goal, along with an initial assessment of associated costs with the various pathways. And I do want to point out that these estimates in this report are intended to serve as a foundation for future work, and they may change over time as additional factors such as system reliability, land use, energy equity are more closely examined, and as technology maturity and cost projections evolve over time. So what I'm trying to say is we don't view this report as a crystal ball to what the power sector will look like in 20 to 25 years. If we just look back 20 years and then look forward to today, we'd see that that would be a fool's errand. But instead, we see this as an initial assessment to guide us in where we need to focus our planning and analytical efforts and what the potential hurdles and opportunities there might be along the way. So throughout this process, we've viewed diverse stakeholder input as a key to success in developing this report, and we believe that we've been successful in that. The report was informed by a diverse array of interests through about a year and a half of public workshops, including a series of scoping workshops that were held across our relatively large state. The agencies also consulted with the California Balancing Authorities, which is required by the statute, and the Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group, which is a group that advises the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission on energy equity and environmental justice issues. So we've really appreciated the strong engagement from both of these groups, as well as the public and other stakeholders, some of which are listed here throughout this process. And again, we viewed this as an integral part of producing a useful and informative report. All right, so getting into the technical work, which is where I spent most of my focus, we hired Energy and Environmental Economics, more well known as E3, to conduct the modeling to execute the joint agency's scenario framework. So E3 used a capacity expansion model called Resolve to model the resource investments needed over time to meet the SB 100 target. The specific version of the model we used was adapted from the PUC's Integrated Resource Planning Processes model. It was adapted for this specific effort. And in short, the model is a simplified representation of the California grid and optimizes selection of new renewable gas resources and integration resources such as storage in order to meet future demand and policy goals. So I'll talk about a few of the scenarios that we ran. but the main focus is in our core scenario that achieves SB 100 and relatively high electrification futures and only includes commercialized technologies with publicly available and vetted cost and performance data for selection. So some might say that the cost curves in our model were relatively conservative. And then on this slide, we can see the resources that were modeled as renewable and zero carbon technologies. So in order for resources to qualify as a zero carbon resource in the model, the resources had to either be RPS eligible or have zero on-site greenhouse gas emissions. So specifically, the renewable and zero carbon resources included were new and existing solar voltaic, existing solar thermal, new and existing onshore wind and new offshore wind, new and existing geothermal, new and existing bioenergy, new green hydrogen fuel cells, existing small and large hydro facilities, and existing nuclear power plants. And then this list will continue to be updated in the future as emerging technologies mature and come to market. So again, this is just an initial assessment, and we do expect this picture to evolve moving forward. All right, so now we're going to review some of our scenario results. And we're going to keep this at a very high level for today. I believe the results presentation at our workshop takes nearly an hour. So if you're interested in more detail, we'll of course have the Q&A today. And then the full report is again posted on the Energy Commission's website. So overall, what our modeling results told us was that in order to meet our SB 100 goals, while electrifying large portions of the rest of the economy, California will need to roughly triple its current electric grid capacity. So on this slide, we see the projected new clean energy resources in comparison to the clean energy resources on the California grid today, or in, I guess, 2019. So in the 2030 and 2045 columns, these are the cumulative new selection to that year. And then looking specifically at the 2045 column, the SB 100 modeling projects that we'll need nearly 70 gigawatts of new utility scale solar, nearly 30 gigawatts of new customer solar, nearly 50 gigawatts of battery storage, 4 gigawatts of long duration storage, which was the maximum potential allowed in the model, 12.6 gigawatts of onshore wind, 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, which again was the maximum potential allowed in the model, and then about 100 megawatts of geothermal. So all of these resources, in order to meet our 100% renewable and zero carbon electricity target in 2045 in a high electrification future. And then altogether, these resources are projected to increase annual costs by about 6% above our 60% RPS baseline scenario in 2045. So in order to achieve this massive build out of renewable energy and storage resources, this will require sustained record-setting build rates through 2045. This includes a tripling of our solar and wind build rates from our 10-year historic average. So we're looking at about 3 gigawatts of solar per year and 1 gigawatt of wind per year, and an 8-fold increase in battery build rates from 2020. So it's about 1 gigawatt per year. So this presents a potential challenge when we start to think about land use planning and land use impacts, but also an enormous opportunity in terms of workforce and workforce development. In addition to modeling meeting our core SB 100 scenario, the joint agencies explored several sensitivities and several scenarios outside the scope of SB 100. So the sensitivities were largely around future electric demand and resource availability. Highlighting one of the sensitivities that's not shown on this slide was a high demand flexibility scenario that included 6 gigawatts of load flexibility. So this additional flexibility resulted in less batteries, increased gas plant retirement, and lower overall costs. So this is something that we think is important moving forward. The joint agencies also modeled several study scenarios outside the scope of SB 100 that are intended to inform broader state planning efforts on energy, climate, and public health. And we can see some of those scenarios here on this slide. So this included a no combustion scenario where all combustion resources, including gas-fired power plants, are retired by 2045. The initial results indicated that this scenario would increase annual costs by about 12% in 2045. And we see this scenario as an important benchmark and starting place for conversations around what it would look like to retire the gas fleet and other combustion resources. Next, zero carbon firm resource scenarios included the option of a generic zero carbon firm resource that represents the commercialization of emerging technologies such as green hydrogen combustion or natural gas with 100% or near 100% carbon capture, or a reduction in the cost of existing firm resources like geothermal. And when these resources were included, it decreased annual electricity system costs by about $2 billion or about 3% in 2045. And then finally, the joint agencies also modeled several scenarios that accelerated the SB 100 target to 2040, 2035, and 2030. And these results indicated that these targets may be achievable, but may also increase overall costs. And again, all of these findings are preliminary and do require further analysis. And there's further detail around all of these in the report. So here's our key takeaways from the SB 100 modeling. First and most importantly, the initial analysis suggests that SB 100 is technically achievable through multiple pathways. Second, in order to meet SB 100, construction of clean electricity generation and storage facilities must be done at a sustained record-setting rate. Third, modeling showed that diversity in clean energy resources and technologies lowers overall costs. It also showed that retaining some natural gas power capacity may minimize costs while ensuring uninterrupted power supply during the transition to 100% clean electricity. However, increased energy storage and advancements in zero carbon technologies may reduce those natural gas capacity needs. And finally, further analysis is needed, again, as this is just the initial assessment of the 2045 SB 100 policy. So specifically, our recommendations for future analysis includes first verifying that the scenario results satisfy the state's grid reliability requirements across a range of conditions. As I mentioned, the model used a simplified representation of the California grid. So this is an essential next step. Second, continuing to evaluate the potential effects of cost-saving emerging resources, such as offshore wind, long-duration storage, green hydrogen technologies, and demand flexibility. Third, assessing environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits of the additional clean electricity generating capacity and storage needed to implement SB 100. And then finally, holding annual workshops to support alignment among the joint agencies and continuity between the SB 100 report. All right, so thank you for your attention. And again, I just want to acknowledge the contributions that so many staff put into this report. Here we have a link for the SB 100 webpage where you can find a copy of the full report, the report summary, and if you're still inclined, the actual model that was used in the report in case you're a modeler. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to Warren. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Liz. Before we go on to the second presentation, let me ask you a couple of clarifying questions that came up. In your scenarios, what assumptions were made, if anything, about in-state versus out-of-state generation?
So there were the restrictions that are usually placed in the model around how much can be simultaneously imported or exported. And then as far as the resource availability, there are out-of-state resources that are available in that core scenario to be selected. And then we did have a scenario that did not allow out-of-state wind, and so we could see what the impact of having that out-of-state wind availability was.
Okay, thanks. And then the second question I want to ask, you mentioned that the no combustion scenario you came up with would increase costs by 12% in 2045, but you had previously mentioned that your core scenarios would increase costs 6% by that time. Was the no combustion scenario an extra 12%, or does that mean an extra 6% beyond the 6% you would be having anyway?
All right, great question. It's an extra 12%. So it's 6% between a 60% RPS and the 100% renewable and zero carbon, and then another 12% on top of that to get to that no combustion scenario.
Okay, great, thank you. We'll have time for more questions later, but let's go to our second presentation and let me introduce our second speaker, who's Nicholas Ucci, who's Commissioner of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources, or OER. And OER is the state's lead agency on energy policy and programs. During his time at OER, Commissioner Ucci has helped expand the state's clean energy portfolio nearly tenfold, while advancing Rhode Island's standing as a national leader in energy efficiency innovation. He serves on the Board of Managers for the New England States Committee on Electricity. He also serves as Executive Director of the Rhode Island Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council, and as Vice Chairman of the state's Executive Climate Change Council. Let me turn it over to Nicholas Ucci. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Warren. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here and talk a little bit about the work that we have done here in Rhode Island to lay out our pathways to 100% renewables by the end of the decade, which is the fastest pace in the nation. So our work began with an executive order signed by our previous governor, Governor Gina Raimondo, who's now the nation's Commerce Secretary. And she challenged us to conduct economic and energy market analyses to develop policies and pathways to achieve this goal. And she gave us less than a year to do it, and we got it done. I want to acknowledge our consultant colleagues at the Brattle Group who were instrumental in helping us develop this analysis and the resulting pathways. Okay. So as you can see from this timeline, stakeholder input was quite valuable. We held multiple technical workshops throughout the project at key points, and we also held several community listening sessions to engage the broader public on this work. We found them quite insightful. They actually almost turned into virtual coffee hours where we had open discussion and Q&A with those members of the public who joined. I'd also like to note that we summarized a good deal of the public comment we received in writing or during our workshops and include responses to those collated observations in our full report. We provide a list of commentators as well. So the way we put this report together is we looked at 4 integrated components. One, we wanted to develop some foundational principles to help both align with the executive order state policy goals and also reflect stakeholder feedback to guide our work ahead. We, of course, conducted robust technical analysis informed by those principles, which helped illuminate costs and benefits of various hypothetical resource portfolios to get us to 100%. We had stakeholder input throughout the process, as I already mentioned, and then all of that information helped inform the policy and programmatic recommendations that I'll touch upon later on in this presentation. I won't spend a lot of time here on our foundational and guiding principles. I think for many of the states who are in this space and aggressively looking to decarbonize, these should not be unfamiliar to you. We group them into decarbonization, economic, and policy implementation principles. So first, of course, we had to start with what Rhode Island's electricity demand would look like a decade from now. So we accounted for our robust expectations around continued least cost procurement and energy efficiency, behind the meters solar PV, thermal, and transportation electrification, as well as general trends that we're seeing here in Rhode Island on electricity consumption. Generally speaking, up here in New England, we're anticipating as a region to more than double our load in the coming decades as a result of beneficial electrification and the decarbonization of the rest of our economies. We then analyzed what it would take to get to that estimated electric demand and where we are at today. With the expected addition of 400 megawatts of offshore wind capacity from the Revolution Wind project in 2024, which is already contracted and has its regulatory approvals here in Rhode Island, we are on pace to support about 3,060 gigawatt hours of renewable electricity generation in 2030. This equates to about 40% of our projected demand in that year. Now, based on our analysis of load forecasts and trends in energy efficiency and electrification, Rhode Island will need to add about 4,600 gigawatts hours, more than twice what we already have, of additional renewable energy to close the remaining gap. And that reflects a relatively flat outlook for electricity demand. The estimated renewable energy gap may be 600 to 700 gigawatt hours larger or smaller, depending on the rate at which transportation and heating sectors electrify to increase demand and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the future progress of energy efficiency efforts that decrease demand. We've translated that here into some bookend cases. So looking at these resource types in isolation and accounting for their capacity factors, we've provided some nameplate equivalents to the amount of energy we'll require or the amount of capacity we'll require to fill that gap. And again, I think folks who are familiar in this space, this will not come as too much of a surprise. Our access in close proximity, potential for offshore wind here in federal waters off the New England coast is substantial. And so we continue to look at opportunities in that burgeoning industry. And sort of on the flip side, at the other end of the spectrum is small and mid-scale solar, locally developed, which here is labeled retail solar, and of course, you need a lot more to get to the same place. We know that our future here in Rhode Island will include a mix of these technologies, but again, this helps gives policymakers and stakeholders, a good way to sort of view the work ahead. It's also critical that we establish policies and programs that allow us to maintain that 100% renewable standard in the coming decades. And so we did look and analyze, estimated increases in demand resulting from what we believe will be the ramp up of beneficial electrification beyond 2030 here in Rhode Island and in the New England region. probably not unlike many of the studies you all have worked on in other states. We tried to account for as much of the variability as we could, looking at resource acquisition costs, the potential for local economic impacts, as well as regional energy market revenues. And we, in our report, try to boil that all down to potential net costs for ratepayers under a range of portfolios, resource portfolios, including looking at GDP and job impacts. Of course, there are other, very important factors, including environmental sustainability, equity, other land use issues that we could not monetize in this report, but they exist, and we know that they represent significant challenges and potentially significant opportunities as the Rhode Island energy system decarbonizes. So speaking of resource acquisition costs, again, we really focused on these 4 renewable types, which we believe are the most viable and potentially scalable, and available to Rhode Island. We are connected, for those of you who are outside the New England region, we are interconnected as a 6-state region through ISO New England, our RTO. And so we do have market access to significant land-based wind resources, particularly in the northern part of our region. Of course, retail and wholesale scale solar. And as I mentioned, along here in the eastern seaboard, this burgeoning new offshore wind industry that for us also represents not just scalable carbon-free resources, but a renewable energy resource with its highest capacity factor during our winter months when we face the potential for natural gas constraints due to dual use of that fuel for heating during our cold weather months. So this is generally, I think, the slide that most people want to go to right away, which is, what is it going to cost? And we're very honest in this report about that, because to do otherwise, A, is fooling ourselves, B, is not being honest with our stakeholders, and C, won't help us get to where we need to go. There are absolutely policy trade-offs, economic trade-offs, with all of these resource types and achieving the goal in general. And it's important for us to weed through that, sort through it, and help get Rhode Island to a good place where we can balance all of these different variables. So again, this chart represents some technology bookends, and we provide the diamonds present sort of a midpoint range of costs, in essence, to develop any of these resources, to contract for them, and net out the market revenue that can be attained from selling those attributes back into the market. Rhode Island is looking at anywhere from $2 billion to $4.5 billion or more within a decade to get to that end point. And for a state our size, that is not insignificant. Now that's just cost. And this next slide, takes those numbers and sort of boils them down to an average monthly bill for a typical residential customer here in the state. And again, as I'm sure many other states know that we have a lot of low and moderate income consumers, particularly during the economic downturn associated with the COVID crisis, and that are struggling to pay their bills right now every day. And here in New England, we also have some of the highest energy prices in the country already, and we're adding on to that, important but still costly public policy investments to achieve our, vitally important environmental goals and to generate economic activity and jobs. But those benefits accrue over time. And consumers today sitting at the kitchen table, or small businesses looking to balance their books, they have to pay those utility bills now. And that's where a lot of the revenue comes from that supports these programs driving renewable development in our state. So we're cognizant of that, and we know that that's a significant challenge moving ahead. But as I said, that's sort of the cost side of the ledger. We also wanted to take a real good hard look at what the benefits might be to the Rhode Island economy under a variety of bookend resource portfolios and also mixed portfolios of resources, which is more likely to be closer to where we'll wind up. So this is a representative slide here of looking at a single 600 megawatt offshore wind project, accounting for potential construction expenditures in our state. We know that these resources and the amount of construction activity associated with offshore wind in particular is likely to be spread out across the region. So Rhode Island will not get all of that investment dollars, but that's okay. We just want to get our fair share, and we're working hard to do that. And of course, over time, there are tariff impacts. Those costs, as I just mentioned, that consumers have to pay to ensure a viable resource deployment. And here in this again singular instance, we've calculated a real positive net GDP impact, from offshore wind, and that changes depending on which resource type you look at and the scale of those resources. So here is sort of a similar analysis, but reflecting potential job growth instead of just GDP. And again, some real potential positive impact from those investments in clean energy resources. Again, very acute for both offshore wind and retail solar. This is sort of that same math, but looking at that bookend offshore wind portfolio. In essence, achieving the gap, Rhode Island's gap to get to 100% renewables. If you were just to do that with offshore wind, significant net GDP impact, significant opportunities for jobs. But we note that there's more uncertainty the longer you go out in these types of analyses. And so we've calculated these results through 2040, but operating maintenance and tariff impacts are likely to continue beyond that time frame, particularly where we're looking at industries that are commanding 20 or 25-year contracting. This chart gives a good summary of the net GDP impacts across those bookend portfolios. It also shows the potential range of outcomes based on several factors. And this is where the real uncertainty comes in. And that includes where regional market prices for renewable energy certificates may go, resource cost uncertainty, whether the resources are located in state, which is the dark shading, versus located out of state, the outlined portion of the bars. Of course, those resources that are located out of state may come at a lower cost, potentially, to consumers, but not come with those GDP and job benefits to our local economy. The high-level summary of the economic impacts of each candidate renewable energy resource enables some additional observations. Achieving 100% renewable electricity by 2030 by targeting in-state offshore wind or solar resources results in net positive economic benefits for Rhode Island, comparing to just purchasing market RECs across most assumptions on resource costs and REC prices. Further, the GDP impact of in-state technologies falls less quickly at higher resource costs, since the negative effects of higher ratepayer costs are partially offset by the positive economic benefits of higher in-state construction and operating and maintenance expenditures. As I mentioned, we moved beyond sort of those bookend cases to build a variety of mixed portfolios, which again are likely more representative of where our future will actually be. Again, these slides will be available, and this presentation will be available after today's session. So I encourage you to view them and go back to our full report and look at some of that data. And again, this figure shows that the net present value of above market costs to achieve this goal for Rhode Island rise from about $2 billion in a mix, but maximum offshore wind portfolio, to $3 billion for what we call portfolio 10, which is sort of solar heavy. And the cost uncertainty also increases because retail solar has higher above market costs and the cost of the other technologies are similar. The overall above market cost of each portfolio is closely related to its retail solar content. The cost uncertainty is primarily driven by the range of resource acquisition costs and results in significant overlap across portfolios. Because these technology portfolios consist of many of the same technologies, their costs are not necessarily independent of one another. For example, portfolios 9 and 10 each have above market cost ranges of about $2 to $5 billion. It's unlikely that one would be significantly more or less costly than the other because they generally have the same composition. I won't spend a lot of time here. This figure shows the GDP impact for each of those portfolios, relatively similar across the in-state renewable energy resources, with retail solar perhaps being slightly lower. And of course, this shows that, no surprise that 100% renewable goal will significantly reduce GHG emissions across our economy. To put this into proper perspective, Rhode Island's long-term GHG emissions goal, which is an 80% reduction below 1990 baselines by 2050, interim targets at 10% reductions by 2020, which we've already met, and 45% reduction by 2035, pretty similar across New England. The 2.4 million tons of additional reduction that will be achieved should we meet this goal on this timeline corresponds to about 19% of our 1990 baseline, making this a very significant step toward the state's long-term emissions reduction goal and timely with respect to our 2035 interim target. So what do we learn? We learned that 100% renewable electricity is achievable, and it's achievable with both in-state and surrounding resources. Of course, we've measured and are honest about the fact that it will require ratepayer support and could generate varying levels of net energy and economic benefits, all dependent upon how that resource portfolio shapes up. All portfolios will require planning and investment to build out those resources themselves. And not surprisingly, balancing supply and demand, particularly beyond 2030, as the rest of our region decarbonizes at a faster pace, will become increasingly important. I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to try to go very quickly about some of our recommendations. Again, full details are available in our report. And by the way, we've also added a very thorough technical support document that gets into all of the modeling assumptions and so on and so forth. So if you need some really heavy weekend reading, go for it. It's on our website. So we took our analysis and we grouped some recommendations across 3 buckets: policy-based, planning and enabling, and equity, which is a very important piece of our work here. We propose that the state advance 100% renewable energy standard that is being debated in our General Assembly right now. Critical to all of it is the continued deployment of cost-effective energy efficiency resources, which, by the way, account for 6 out of every 10 clean energy jobs here in the state, but is also the lowest cost way to achieve our carbon emission reductions. Even lower cost than some of the solar and other renewable technologies we've discussed. And it's critical that we maintain continued support for in-state development while starting to evolve our market, evolve our programs and policies, which were established really at the nascency of this work to deliver more affordable and sustainable outcomes. In other words, as these markets have matured over time, we think that our policies and programs should probably also mature and consider how we can reduce total cost to consumers while achieving the same or even better emissions reduction outcomes. On the planning enabling side, it gets a little more tricky. We've got to work to ensure that we can optimize the electric grid, particularly through collaborative integrated grid planning. Energy storage is, of course, vital, I think, for all of our states to achieve large-scale decarbonization. And again, as a state that is highly integrated with our New England neighbors, regional collaboration will be paramount at the wholesale level. And again, we think it's vital, critical that we center equity and include community engagement as we design or even redesign existing programs and policies to ensure that all Rhode Islanders have access to our clean energy economy. And so it's critical that we partner with trusted frontline community organizations and that we listen and learn from them. We establish some foundational definitions and metrics with those community partners to help us track and monitor progress. And that we take all that information and that support and we improve outcomes as identified and prioritized by our community leaders. So I'll stop there. I want to thank everybody for your time and look forward to some Q&A. Thanks.
Hey, thanks very much, Nicholas. Let me start with a couple questions for you, and then we'll go to a couple for Liz. One of our listeners was asking, in the analysis, it didn't sound like you considered energy storage as part of the package of technologies to be implemented by 2030. Was that a conscious decision, or did it just turn out to be more expensive than what you did model?
No, I think we gave, again, as I just mentioned, it certainly is one of the major recommendations coming out of this report. Rhode Island we've taken a step back in a way almost purposefully on energy storage. We're starting to ramp up now as we've watched some of our larger sister states like California, like Massachusetts, for example, really take the lead, leverage their technological institutions and the benefit of private capital to start to move the market. In a state our size, we can't always command that sort of scale. And so we try to leverage best practices wherever we can. And so we are moving in that direction. We didn't run a hour by hour market simulation and a dispatch model, for example, where you might account for some of that storage deployment. But nonetheless, we know that our clean energy future will be dependent upon those distributed energy resources like storage.
Good. A couple of people asked this, and they said that in part maybe they were misunderstanding some of your conclusions and analysis. It had to do with the difference between the cost of wholesale solar and retail solar. The retail solar was significantly more expensive. And so the question then is, wouldn't it make sense for the state to maximize the use of wholesale solar so that you didn't, especially in-state wholesale solar, so that you didn't need to use as much retail solar?
Well, I think that's one of those policy trade-offs that I mentioned. So, in our resource solar bucket, we include a lot of our in-state programs that develop small, rooftop solar, for example, or solar carports. And so, by their nature, to a degree, those installations, cost more money to develop, and in turn, raises costs on local consumers. In comparison, say, to a large-scale regional competitive procurement for solar, which might generate a project of 50 or 60 or 70 megawatts of solar at scale and benefit from the economies of scale that are derived from that sort of competitive procurement. So we acknowledge that we acknowledge that the cost implications. Sometimes, some of these state-based programs, Rhode Island is not alone in this, are more expensive than other alternatives. But I think policymakers are sitting there weighing the type of local economic development benefits and job creation, tax revenue that can be spurred by, smaller and more localized investment.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask a couple questions that came in for Liz. The first one goes back to the no combustion scenario. And was that specifically related to retiring gas peaker plants, or are there other combustion facilities in California that would be eliminated under that scenario that wouldn't be eliminated otherwise? And then finally, when calculating the 12% additional cost, was any consideration given to any health benefits from eliminating combustion facilities?
Yeah, great question. So on the first question, the no combustion scenario would force retirement over time of the full gas fleet, as well as the biomass facilities. And then for the second question, as far as whether we included health impacts in that cost number or considered that, that's something that we haven't done yet and something that we're exploring. And we know that would be an added benefit. So we're exploring that moving forward.
Okay, great. And someone was also asking, Liz, when you were talking about ramping up battery storage, was that at all including the use of electric vehicle batteries as part of the battery storage resource?
That's also a great question. So when we're talking about the battery storage resources, we're specifically talking about utility scale batteries. Electric vehicle batteries could play into that high demand flexibility scenario that I mentioned, where we had an extra 6 gigawatts of demand flexibility. So we do definitely see a role for these demand side resources with flexible capabilities like EV batteries. But it's something that currently a little bit difficult to model, but definitely something that we're exploring moving forward.
Great. And here's a question for Commissioner Ucci. Has there been any analysis done, or is there an analysis available on the cost of upgrading of the grid required to handle the additional electrical generation capacity that you're talking about? And what would be the timeline for upgrading distribution grid capacity?
Great question, and a tough one, frankly. We did account for a range of costs associated with potential distribution system upgrades, and we gathered some great data both from the dominant electric distribution utility here in Rhode Island, as well as from project developers. And so we did accommodate for some of that, but again, that range is very wide, and it's changes from circumstance to circumstance. We also know that the New England grid itself, the transmission system, will require a pretty robust transformation, particularly to accommodate offshore wind injections into southern New England. And so regionally, our governors have requested of ISO New England a real focus on more proactive transmission planning to accommodate and to help achieve our collective state energy policy goals. So a lot of that work is underway, and what we do know is that again, like so much of this, in the near term, it will be costly, but I don't know that anybody's actually put a firm price tag on what that will look like.
Okay, great. And Liz, a question for you, and this has to do with the extent to which the people working on the report and more generally at the Energy Commission are focused on the role that California plays as an influential leader and sort of beta tester of scenarios and modelers. To what extent were you cognizant of what you do in California might influence decision makers in other parts of the country or even globally? And did that at all influence the choices you put into your analysis?
Yeah, great question. I think that definitely influenced the policy itself, and it is something that we were cognizant of while developing the report, because California has been more on the front lines as far as this transition to clean energy. I think one thing that we've really tried to do is be as transparent as possible during our stakeholder process, and to be clear about our details and assumptions, just to make sure that the work makes sense and is clear to others. So we do, we do think it's important that we're communicating the work that we're doing clearly, and that we do this transition thoughtfully, so we're not maybe persuading others that this isn't the path that they want to take, if that makes sense.
Okay, and I have two questions that I'm going to ask both of you. The first one is, to what extent did your planning consider the role of demand response? And maybe Liz, you can go first, and then Nicholas.
So shed demand response was an option to be picked up in the model. In our core scenarios, it wasn't selected, although there was a certain amount that was already built into those load shapes within the model. And again, we had that high demand flexibility scenario that changed the load shapes to reflect demand response, so like a shift demand response, and reduce the resource adequacy requirement to reflect demand response's ability to meet some of those peak loads. So demand response we view as very important, especially moving forward to these higher renewable penetrations. But as far as the modeling itself, it's a little bit tricky with our current models. So we did look at it, and we do plan on exploring it further moving forward.
Yeah, again, we didn't run a very discrete hour-by-hour model, and so we didn't. I think some of that could be accounted for in our energy efficiency assumptions, which were pretty robust. But nonetheless, it certainly it is considered and mentioned in our report as a vital opportunity that we should be building on here in Rhode Island for a number of reasons, including helping alleviate localized natural gas constraints, which pop up during the winter. So yes, it's absolutely in our bucket of solutions, but wasn't discretely modeled.
Okay, and I'm going to ask one more question to both of you, and then after that, I'll give you each a couple of minutes to say anything else you wish you had had a chance to say up to that point, or answer any question you wish someone had asked you. So the question I am going to ask, though, is were the system benefits of local generation something that factored into either your analysis or your thinking about how to proceed? Things such as the potential for heightened system reliability or reduced transmission and distribution load. Was that something considered at all, or is that for a future day of analysis? And Liz, maybe you should go first.
Yeah, so the local reliability impacts and the local value of resources wasn't explicitly considered in the work that we did for this report. We do think that that's something to explore in the future, and it's something that we hope to do. But we didn't quite get there for this report yet.
Yeah, same here in Rhode Island. Although, in our suite of recommendations, we really strongly encourage and are starting to work on more integrated and forward-looking distribution system planning, and what an exercise like that at the level we're considering would or would not produce in terms of beneficial analysis. And so that could include and would include, I think, a look at known and projected distribution system upgrades to maintain and serve local reliability, but also overlaying on top of that, how to preserve unfragmented forest space in Rhode Island, how to account for local zoning requirements that may determine whether or not solar or other renewable resources can be built in that same space, and of course accounting for projected shifts in load, particularly as heating and transportation electrification occurs.
Thank you. And Liz, is anything else you want to say or anything you wish I had asked you?
I think I'll just highlight kind of 3 of the areas that we see as very important for us to really get further into the weeds moving forward. So the first is, I mentioned that we'll be doing reliability modeling, looking at these portfolios. Again, the model that we use was relatively simplified, and keeping the lights on during this transition and keeping rates as low as possible are all extremely important while aiming to achieve this SB 100 policy. So we're looking forward to working on that, hopefully before even the next report comes out. We're really looking forward to examining emerging resources a little bit more closely. So we're relatively conservative on the resources that we included in this report. And so we really want to kind of dig deeper into what, for example, hydrogen technologies, how they can contribute, especially once we get out towards these longer time frames. And then lastly, we really see land use planning and really looking at land use impacts as an important component moving forward because of the huge capacities of resources that are needed in order to meet SB 100 in this high electrification future. So it's going to take a lot of land to build solar, to build this wind, and doing it thoughtfully is going to be very important and in coordination with local governments. And so, yeah, I think that's what all I have.
Hey, thanks very much. And Nicholas, do you have any famous last words for us?
Well, Warren, I don't know if they'll be famous, but I will say that to encapsulate, there are 3 major challenges that I think our state faces, and I'm sure are shared by many other states as we really accelerate clean energy deployment at these levels. One is, and I integrated these into my slides, I hope. One is consumer affordability. And so, again, these investments need to be made today. They may produce long-term benefits to the economy. They may produce long-term environmental and public health benefits, no doubt, and everyone will share in those to some degree. But the bill has to be paid in many ways today. And how do we balance that in an already high energy price region, coupled with all the other societal demands that are on our economy? So that's one. 2 is environmental sustainability. So whether it's preserving our unfragmented forests and our natural ecosystems, both as a way of life here, but also as an important carbon sink, or it's preserving and ensuring that we have robust fisheries and tourism in our state and federal waters, that's going to be pretty important. And we've got to find a way to be able to do both, to develop and expand renewable deployment, but also preserve those very important ecosystems. And finally is equity. So, learning both as individuals and groups what that means, how that is to be defined, empowering local communities and local voices to help teach us what those outcomes might look like, and then ensuring that we carry that work forward to design and implement programs and policies and incentive-based initiatives to connect those in our historically marginalized and frontline communities to the myriad of potential benefits that we might accrue through continued investment in our clean energy economy.
Hey, thank you. I want to thank both of you for excellent presentations and sharing the good work that's been done in your states. And I want to encourage everybody on the call to go out and look at these two reports. Both you'll learn about what the future may hold for California and Rhode Island. On top of that, you'll get some good ideas for the types of planning studies and the types of questions that could and should be asked in other states. And I hope all of you will come back for future webinars of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. Thank you all.